I'm very excited to hear from our final speaker for the afternoon, Marcus Anthony. I'd like to thank Congressman Payne Jr.'s office for introducing us to Marcus, and we're very pleased to have him here. Since 2003, and as a Teach for America alum, Marcus has worked in the Newark, New Jersey public schools. He has served as a teacher, a grade level subject chair, and a vice principal. He's been deeply engaged in the City of Newark's educational community by creating, implementing, managing, and evaluating various programs. Since 2008, Marcus has recruited and mentored students from the Newark Public Schools for W.E.B. Du Bois Scholars Institute at Princeton University. And last semester, in partnership with the Institute, he directed a mentorship project for Newark and East Orange African American males becoming role models for successful manhood, which operated at the Rutgers Newark campus. Marcus is a doctoral candidate in the joint NJIT Rutgers Urban Systems PhD program and is currently the acting director of teacher education at Rutgers Newark. Marcus, we're very excited to hear you share some of your experiences.
Okay, thank you for saying. I know it's after 1:30, and I promise I won't go too long. But I'm coming before you to talk about some of the issues and challenges that exist at particular schools. So we've talked about various issues that boys face. We've learned about brain development. We've talked about ADHD, culturally responsive programs, etc. But I come to you today speaking as someone who was a teacher and an administrator in a school working with urban boys every day for over 12 years. And I think that it's important that we think about policy implications, right? We think about programming implications. If we do certain things, what happens? If we don't engage in certain ways, what happens? Because when we ignore the research, it's really disastrous, particularly for boys. And if we are able to go deeper, especially marginalized groups, and a lot of times when I'm talking about marginalized groups, I'm speaking about African American and Latino boys. So the presentation that I'm doing today is going to be very, like I said, very practical. The information that I have is based on research that I've gotten from teachers, administrators, aides, parents, psychologists who actually work with boys every day in a school, in a public school setting. So some of the questions that you're going to see, we're not going to be able to spend a lot of time, thinking about them today, but I ask you that you take the presentation at some point and actually read through the questions and think about them, because I know a lot of the people in this room are responsible for creating policies and working with legislators and other government officials to make sure certain things happen. And if we don't get the policies right, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that, the people who suffer most are the boys. And the biggest group of boys who suffer are the marginalized boys. So it's really, really important. So a few questions I'd like to talk about. Let's go to the next slide, please. How do we determine what boys need to be successful? And I know this may seem like a basic question, but there are current debates in terms of trying to figure out, okay, what do we need, right? Do boys need to necessarily sit in rows? Do we have to have a specific structure in class? Do boys necessarily need to progress at the same level as girls? Another thing, how is success being defined? Success for who? So when we think about some of our marginalized boys who may be victims of structural violence, which means they lack access to basic resources, and we have them in classrooms with people who aren't necessarily coming in at the same level, how do we determine success? Is it that they have to meet grade level objectives, or is it that they're meeting other things? So it's really important that we're thinking about that, success for who. And it's interesting because a lot of times in K to 12 education, we don't have the opportunity to have these conversations. We don't have the time to think about these things because we have so many programs that we're attempting to implement. We have a new program, 1 year. It doesn't work because we really didn't partner with the right organization. So they throw the program out and then they start over. So they're not asking these questions. They're not really engaged in research, which includes not just quantitative research, but the qualitative piece, to talk to some of these boys to figure out what happens. It's really interesting to me because we're thinking that boys are supposed to be successful, but a lot of times we don't talk to them. We don't talk to the teachers. We don't talk to administrators. And what happens is that legislation or policies are imposed on them. And so what happens with them? Who decides what behaviors are acceptable? And again, we've learned a lot, and I've learned a lot today in terms of how the brains, being developed. And it's interesting because I'm one of the 99%, one of the 99% who, unfortunately had never seen that, seen the brain. And I'm definitely going to take that back to Rutgers when I go back tomorrow. But when we're thinking about, okay, acceptable behaviors, okay, well, let's look at issues of cultural capital. Cultural capital are the skills that people have in order, like, to help them navigate, their environments. So when we're not necessarily taking the individual boys, their perspective into consideration, behaviors that they may think are acceptable are unacceptable to other people, and most boys are being taught by women, many of whom don't necessarily understand what the boys are doing, so therefore they end up being suspended. They end up being classified. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And when we think about interventions, the last thing, a lot of times in school, so we have boys who are identified as in need of improvement, and so a lot of times intervention means, okay, well, let's put a plan together, monitor the boys for 6 weeks, and then we're going to classify them. Okay, we have to go through this process because we have to be able to substantiate our claim that something's wrong with them. And this happens all over schools, throughout the country, whether it be urban schools or suburban schools. And so these are things that we're going to need to think about. How do we figure out what proper interventions need to occur? So these two questions, these are questions that you can look at another time. And it's interesting because these are things that should be talked about. These are questions that should be, debated. And spending a lot of time would allow us to be able to create policies that work for boys, right? But unfortunately, that's not the case. Let's move on to the next slide. So my new role is acting director at Rutgers-Newark. And it's interesting because part of the reason why I got the role is because some of the research that I've done as it relates to teacher preparation programs. And I'm realizing that we have urban education programs, teacher education programs that aren't even connected to K-12 schools. So we have teacher preparation programs that are training teachers to work with boys who have all, of these issues, but they're not stepping foot in schools. And so there was an education schools report that came out of Columbia back in 2005, and the numbers are, somewhat similar today, that showed that 30 to 45% of people who teach in higher ed, they're teaching and training students have zero connection. So then when we're thinking about how teachers are trained, are we surprised that we're seeing these trends as it relates to what's going on with boys, and why aren't people seeing these things? We're looking at changing curricula. Currently, we've shifted from state standards to the Commons Core national standards, and what implications does that have for teachers? So you're constantly shifting programs, you're changing curricula, and with the shift, moving from state standards to national standards, the goal is, or the aim is, mastery versus progress or proficiency. And mastery, and I know that may seem like a matter of semantics, but with mastery, the assumption is that if students don't master all of the grade level objectives at the end of the year at a higher level, something's wrong with the teacher. So as a result, what happens? Schools are pressure cookers because teachers are trying to ensure that students are making adequate progress. They have all of these, boys in the classroom who aren't necessarily on the same level, and have all of these developmentally appropriate. They're boys. They're doing what boys do, but they're not being addressed. So then what happens? You have these boys in the classroom. You have teachers who are trying to teach and meet standards, higher standards. And so students who can't necessarily sit down for 45 minutes through an entire lesson, or students who can't stay quiet, what happens? They get classified, they're kicked out of class. And then then you have these boys at an early age thinking that school isn't for them and they can't be successful. Next slide. Federal policies, federal, state, and local policies that impact teachers and administrators. And for you, those of you who are working on policies, I encourage you to please talk to school teachers, school administrators, and students who are in K-12 schools. A lot of these policies that are created I mean, it's hard. I mean, and I know there's a whole political, movement, and there are certain things that we're trying to do in terms of increasing standards, preparing students or for the, to be 21st century citizens. But a lot of there's a disconnect. So, for instance, as a result of policies such as No Child Left Behind, right? No Child Left Behind was a policy that basically said that by the end of 2013-14, 100% of students across the country were supposed to be literate, and they were supposed to be proficient in literacy and math. And when the policy came out, educators and other people, like everybody within, I can't say everybody, but people, teachers, effective teachers, principals, parents even realized back then that unless we really address these socio-emotional issues, unless we start partnering with mental health workers, organizations, culturally responsive educators, this is not going to work. So what happened as time progressed, schools are being closed down, teachers are being fired, principals are being allocated. The stability that a lot of the boys had is completely gone. And so what behaviors do you expect from boys who need that guidance, that nurturing, that support? So it's really important that we're thinking about our vulnerable groups when we're thinking about those policies. And one thing that's another point that's common: implementing scripted curricula with fidelity. Very popular in education, and right now. So the expectation is that teachers run through curricula right as fast as they can. They don't have any time to waste because students are supposed to be tested regularly. And if you have boys that aren't where you feel that they need to be based on a social construct, what happens? We have boys being left behind. Next slide. And so how do school officials respond? Okay, because remember, in order for schools to remain open, in order for schools to remain in compliance, in order for schools to maintain their status, schools must be strategic about how they construct lessons and the school day. So what do you have? A lot of schools no longer have physical education, or it's a joke. They no longer teach health. They're no longer concerned with a holistic approach to learning. Students are no longer able to have recess. After school programs that we may have participated in are a lot of times more so focused on basic skills, drill and kill, and students are frustrated. Boys can't take it, and we're seeing this every day in schools. So I just want you to understand that these policies that are created, like, we have to consider the boys along the way, and it's interesting when I think about this, because I've been on the ground and working with them every day, and it seems common sense to me, but I know there's a disconnect, but I just wish that people would stop and think about what's going on and really try to dig deeper than the surface, because anytime you see a school that's doing well or a school that's failing, there are lots of factors that play into that, and those factors aren't going to be adequately addressed just by having more tests. Again, teaching and learning. We have to get to the point where teachers aren't forced just to teach, and that they're actually able to meet the needs of students. But when they're bombarded with curricula, when they're bombarded with supplemental materials that tell them that they have to implement them, or they could potentially lose their jobs, it makes it hard for them, because they no longer are able to effectively meet the needs of boys, because if they do that, it may require them to meet the students where they are. And you have students who enter classrooms on many different levels. You can have a boy who's in first grade, and as a result of his background experiences, he may not be as verbal as another boy. But when they're implementing Common Core curriculum, the assumption is that everybody's on level and that they'll eventually catch up, which is so crazy to me, that it doesn't matter what grade level you enter in, they'll teach you at that grade, even if it's a fifth grader on a first grade level. The assumption is that you'll eventually catch on, and we're constantly losing boys. Next slide. Oh, and also, I'm sorry, pendulum swings. My biggest pet peeve in education will move from zero tolerance policies, where I'm sure you've seen the news where they'll expel a kindergartner for having a fingernail file, right? And then then the public, comes up and starts, talking about, oh, this is crazy, and then, or you have a new mayor or governor who says, well, okay, well, we're going to change from zero tolerance policies, and we're just going to have restorative justice, and nobody gets suspended for anything. And so those are like when we don't really, well, I mean, like when we fail to try to have a deeper understanding versus implementing policies based on a political agenda. I mean, I just can't stress this point enough that it really has a negative effect on boys. Next slide, please. And so, again, strict timeline, I talked about this in terms of schools of education, teaching and learning, a lack of flexibility, again, unable to meet the needs of your students, no time to waste bulldozing through lessons without adequately ensuring that students have mastered the materials, blaming teachers and administrators for issues that are normal for boys, and also having a narrow definition of achievement. So achievement in public schools today is based on standardized tests. If your students do well on standardized tests, you're seen as an effective school. But if not, your school is seen as a problem. Next slide. And so looking at the parent-teacher relationships, and it's interesting because certain parents trust teachers and administrators, and they believe everything that they say. Some of it's culture, some of it's based on their experiences, but based on all of the things that are going on in schools, there are a lot of parents who no longer trust the education system because they know their children, they know they can learn, but a lot of times boys aren't treated as if they are able to learn. Again, negative perception of boys. I mean, you pretty much know what that means, and compliance versus meeting the needs of the children. We're in a compliance era in public schools today, whereas teachers are scared. They're scared that if they don't, get through the lesson, if they're not at a specific point at a specific time, their jobs are in jeopardy. So then what do you do if you're a teacher? Are you really going to try to meet the needs of children if your job is in jeopardy? I don't know. And I think that's something to really consider when we're thinking about these policies as well. Next slide. Is that no, I think that's the last one. So I just wanted to give you a little background about what is actually going on in the schools on a daily basis, and for you just to think about this and constantly ask these questions and challenge other people when they're giving surface level answers for problems or problems that are much more complex, because each school is different. Working with boys is a complex challenge, and even as much experience as I have working with them and being a difficult boy as a child, I still don't understand. So thank you for staying. I really appreciate the fact that everybody didn't leave. Thank you.